So it's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker today, Olli Heikkinen from this particular institute, Sibelius-Academy of the University of Arts, or how does it go nowadays? Anyway.
I really don't know how to admit. I'm not quite sure.
The beauty of university administration and the inevitable change that takes place there. Anyway, Olli is a member of a researcher in a project called Rethinking Finnish Music History. There it is, yes, absolutely. And he will be talking about the search of Finnish national music in the 19th century. Please.
Yes, thank you. My sub-project in this research project is that first one, the emergence of Finnish musical language. So I'm mainly interested in nationalism in music in the 19th century. That's why my presentation is titled In Search of National Music in 19th Century Finland. Brand new presentation. I just completed half an hour ago, but now it's ready. So I decided to approach the theme music and nationalism by examining the use of the concept national music in Finnish newspapers in the 19th century. Although that concept, national music, doesn't have much currency nowadays in newspapers or in any conversation, in 19th century it was quite common indeed. Nationella musik in Swedish and kansallinen musiikki in Finnish, or kansallismusiikki, that kind of word was used. For a start, I give an example. In 1892, a heated argumentation erupted in Pori, which is a medium-sized town in the western coast of Finland. The target of the debate was the subsidy given by the city to the local city orchestra. Finnish language newspaper Satakunta published an editorial in which it blamed the musical society of the town and its orchestra for heading to the cosmopolitan direction, which, it said in the editorial, is foreign to our own Finnish nationality. Things would have certainly been different if the society from the beginning would have settled on a national ground. First exercised national music, kansallista musiikkia, and after that tried to advance to the cosmopolitan and universal level. The musical society answered that national aspirations was not their main business, but we return to this later. History of the term national music is much longer, of course. According to Matthew Gelbart's fine book, The Invention of Folk Music and Art Music, in English language discussion of music, the term national music was widely in use already in the 18th century. And I ground my theoretical points very extensively to Gelbart's book because his arguments are very persuasive and very succinct. Gelbart's main argument is that during the 18th century, the origin of music was becoming more and more important when music was being classified into distinct categories. As a good example of this, he gives the case of Scotland and Scottish melodies, which were published in various collections at that time. In 1725, William Thomson published a collection of Scots melodies called Orpheus Caledonius. 7 of those melodies were ascribed to David Rizzio. Rizzio was an Italian-born nobleman who worked as a private secretary for Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, it was 16th century, yes. That Scottish melodies were composed by an Italian didn't cause any sensation at all at that time. Scottish, in those melodies, the title Scottish referred more to a musical style than to the geographical origin. But about 20 years later, in the beginning of 1740s, when James Oswald, another Scot, published a collection called Second Collection of Curious Scots Tunes, and claimed that 6 of the tunes were composed by Rizzio. That caused some objections. He was accused of using a famous person, because Rizzio was very famous. He was executed by the Mary Stuart's husband. And that was a very famous accident. He was jealous. Anyway, this James Oswald was accused of using a famous person's name to market his collection. And that might be right. Maybe he did. Maybe he thought that the buying public would consider those melodies to be especially elegant Scottish melodies because they were composed by an Italian. At that time, in British Isles, Italian musicians were very much in charge of the whole music business. But the trend was changing. In some writings, Rizzio was named even as the father of Scottish music, but finally his Italian origins began to matter. The next candidate to be the father of Scottish music was James I, who was the king of Scotland in the 15th century. For example, Sir John Hawkins, in his famous General History of Science and Practice of Music from the 1770s, was of that opinion. But even this conception was soon rejected, and the reason for this was the change in concepts nature, science, and art, which happened gradually in the 18th century. In the beginning of the century, these concepts didn't connote any kind of juxtapositions. Science and art were in no way opposed to nature, but instead were in a way an extension of it. They were meant to imitate nature and its laws. But during the century, a new kind of vision of history started to gain foothold. According to it, history was linear, teleological, there is some kind of telos in that process, progressive, it goes all the way up, and it's universal, chain of events and processes. Mankind was on its way from the original and natural state of affairs to something totally different. What that something totally different was varied between different thinkers and writers. But anyhow, what is essential is that civilization meant getting farther away from nature. And so science and art were not anymore considered as an extension of nature, but the opposite of nature. This new kind of vision is clearly visible also in music historiography in the end of the 18th century. Many multi-volume books in many different languages were published in which the universal development and progress of music from primitive people to modern higher music was sketched out. And of course, as you probably will guess, climax of the story was modern European music. One other thing which is common to all these books is that the music history is delineated by nations. The usual storyline goes from primitive people like Vedda people in Ceylon through Japanese, Chinese, to ancient nations like Hebrews and Egyptians, then to ancient Greeks and so on. This kind of arrangement is still visible, for example, in music history books in Finland by Martin Vegelius and Heikki Clementi, and in fact all the way to the 1950s when universalism of music history came under suspicion. So now we can get back to the term national music. In English language discussion in the 18th century, it was used interchangeably with another term, natural music. National music was music of a nation which was still in its infancy, in its natural states. Even if a nation had made a progress, as European nations usually were considered to have made, remnants or survivals from its original state of nature were still being found. And music survivals, of course, were the national songs and melodies which were collected and published. In German language discussion, Nationalmusik or Nationallied was interchangeable with Volksmusik or Volkslied. For example, in an article in which Johann Gottfried Herder coined the term word Volkslied, he also used the word Nationallied, meaning just the same. But back to Scotland. In the end of the 18th century, the position of James I as an originator of Scottish music was replaced by bards and minstrels, you know, those with the harp. But because they belonged to the upper classes of the nation, even they were displaced. Their place was taken by anonymous shepherds and maids, that means the ordinary people, the folk. Most clearly, this new vision was expressed by Joseph Ritson in an article published in 1794. According to him, the melodies of Scottish lowlands, not highlands but lowlands, were composed by persons who are uncultivated, uncorrupted by art. That means art means corruption. Corruption from the original natural state. And influenced only by the dictates of pure and simple nature. And he explicitly discards the idea that those were composed by James I, because James I would have produced mere art instead of pure nature. But let's leave Matthew Kelpart and Scotland for a while, and let's look at the newspapers in Finland in the 19th century. How did these changes in meanings between art and nature manifested themselves in the newspapers? I searched the newspapers using different search words in Finnish and Swedish, like musiikkitaide, taidemusiikki, musiikkonst, konstmusiik, säveltaide, toonkonst, kansallinen musiikki, kansallismusiikki, and nationell musiik. And the results were quite interesting. The analysis is still going on, but there is something that I can tell you right now. The first use of the term konstmusik, or taidemusiikki, in this case in Swedish, konstmusik, which is art music in English, that I could find is from the year 1860. In Vasabladet there was an article considering Swedishness in Swedish musical art, or art of music, toonkonst. I don't know how to translate it into English exactly. Music. Anyway, it's not art music. Maybe it's musical art, the art of music. I don't know. The writer was of the opinion that you can find Swedish peculiarity in Swedish natural music. It's the naturmusik. Finnish i vår naturmusik. But not in Swedish art music, konstmusik. Then ei i vår konstmusik. This contrasting of nature and art complies perfectly with the notion that Gelbart is describing in his book. However, there is one new idea in this article further on. According to the writer, folk music or folk songs didn't originate among the folk, but instead they were composed in the Middle Ages by professional musicians. But they were preserved by the folk until the upper classes took them back, and started to take care of them. And this way, natural melodies, naturtonerna, moved to the more rule-bound area, and that way were elevated into the field of art. This vision of the origin of folk music is usually known by the German name gesunkenes Kulturgut, and all descended culture materials. It is also quite interesting that in this writing both natural music and art music belong to the art of music, tonkonst, säveltaide. This relation between these terms seems to be quite common at that time. Next year, in 1861, in a newspaper called Barometern, an anonymous writer states that Kullervo Overture by Philip von Santz would be much more popular if it would have been more Finnish, whatever that means. He also states that art music is more or less cosmopolitan, which leaves folk songs to mission to reflect nationalities. Also in this writing, art music is delineated with folk music. And the same is also true of the article on the Norwegian people published the same year in Folkvennen. The writer tells that with joy he listens to the melodies of the mountain people in Norway. Although they don't always obey modern rules, anyhow, they are more thoughtful and pleasant than most of the modern art music. So in the middle of the 19th century, national music, or natural music, or folk music, at that time they are synonyms, was an opposite of art music. But of course, this is not the whole story of national music and nationalism in music. For example, in this article on nationalism in Grove's dictionary, Richard Taruskin is not so much interested in nationalism in folk music, but instead nationalism in art music. But how can we move from national music as music of nature to national music as music of art? How is national art music possible? And also to this question we find an answer in Kelpart's book. According to him, what is most important in writings of Johann Gottfried Herder is not that he coined the word Volkslied, because the concept of folk song and folk melodies, which meant the same thing, had been around in English language conversation much earlier. Instead, it is the fact that he mediated a new conception of art to musical circles. Previously, art as an opposite to nature meant art as artificial, not natural, rule-bound, and closer to science than nature. In contrast, the creative genius was part of the nature. That means he who followed the rules couldn't be natural. In this new conception of art, which Herder supported and mediated, art transcended and synthesized science, meaning rules, and natural or organic genius. Genius was something available to both primitive folk collectives and great artists. In general language discussion, this applied to all of the arts, but especially well it fit to music, which, you know, is the most German of the arts, according to Germans. This new art music captured the same values: genius, authenticity, purity, which had been previously attributed to the folk. This also meant that to be an artist was more than to be a handicraftsman. And now direct citation from Kelbart. To be an artistic genius now meant to grow organically out of the national and universal genius, to synthesize achievement with an ineffable quality of inspiration drawn from a folk wellspring that was universally human but channeled through the individual. And more still. From this point onward, folk and art were never direct opposites, as national and cultivated had been. Rather, folk, freedom, inspiration, and science rules were opposites, while art synthesized the two on a new level through individual genius. simultaneously also synthesizing the collective and the individual aspects of the earlier categories. And now, playground was ready for Sibelius in Finland, but later to that. But now back to the Finnish newspapers again. In the 1880s, the meaning of the terms säveltaide, musiikkitaide, toonkonst or musikkonst remained quite the same as previously. They referred to all kinds of music making. For example, in this news from Viipurin Sanomat from 1888, there was a lot of different kinds of musical activity going on in Lappeenranta on that summer 88. There were military brass bands exercising, there was music played on the streets, and there were also Russian soldiers playing their hand harmonicas, whatever that is. Well, it's haitari, some kind of haitari. Even that was art of music or musical art, but not art music, that's for sure. Art music, taidemusiikki, konstmusiik, was beginning to have other types of music than folk music, with which it was compared. For example, in Vaasa Tidning in 1887, in a critique of a popular concert by the local orchestra, writer makes clear difference between popular music and art music. There were popular quartet singing and a song for tenor soloist, but other program contained many beautiful products of art music. Next year in Vasabladet, might be the same writer, the writer anyhow criticized the performance of Cherubini's Requiem for not accentuating properly the onset of different themes as should be in this kind of art music in a strict sense. So he made there are different kind of art music. There is art music in strict sense, and then there is something other. In 1890, in a short history of Musikaliska Sällskapet in Åbo, there was some mention of theatre performances by the orchestra, but it was emphasized that art music proper, egentliga konstmusiikken, was still played in the concerts. So it seems that songs and couplets performed in theatre were not art music. Art music was having a new competitor, popular music, although there was not an established word for it, at least in Finnish. But it worried people in the field of art music. For example, in 1891, Ilmari Kruun, the father of Finnish musicology, was attending an international folklore conference in London, and he wrote reports to the newspaper Uusi Suometar. In one of those reports, he expressed his firm opinion that folk music in Finland will never be a prey to street music, as it has been in many other countries. But instead, our young art music, absorbing the spirit of folk music, will give it back to the people and teach it how to love it and how to conserve its own property. And now only one question remains: how to do it? How to absorb the spirit of folk music and how to represent that spirit in art musical works. And now to Sibelius. There are many ways to nationalize art music, to make it sound national art music. One way is to attach it to a text or a topic of national importance. For example, when Fredrik Paasius composed an opera titled Kung Kaarts Jakt, King Charles's Hunt in 1852, or Princess of Cyprus in 1860. That's one way. The other way is to use Kalevala in one form or another. For example, Philip von Sandt's composed overture called Kullervo in 1860, but according to critics, for example, the aforementioned critic, there was not so much Finnish in that overture except the title. Robert Kajanus composed Kullervon Surumarssi, as well as overture titled Aino, which is based on Kalevala. Another way of nationalizing music is to use folk melodies, which were collected and published in 1850s onwards. For example, Kajanus composed 2 Finnish rhapsodies, which used folk melodies directly. He was inspired by the works of his Norwegian teacher, Johan Svensson. But despite all of these efforts, the music critics of the early 1890s still have many doubts about the very existence of a Finnish musical language. The problem with most of the compositions, according to critics, was that they bore too many references to the German masters. For example, Kajanus, who was very Wagnerian at that time. But then comes Sibelius. Carl Flodin, music critic, had already claimed to detect Finnish characteristics in Sibelius' music in the early 1890s. The symphonic poem Kullervo removed all these existing doubts. Another critic, Oskar Merikanto, wrote unambiguously, here we have the first innately Finnish tonal work, and continued, we recognize these tones as our own, although we have never heard them quite like this before. So how did Sibelius manage where others had previously failed? I think the most important reason must be the decision that he made during the composition process. Instead of relying on Finnish folk melodies, as for example Kajanus did, he kept developing his own tonal language towards a more original direction. Apart, he was avoiding Wagner explicitly. And this originality was recognized by the critics and was deemed to originate from the same source as the Finnish national spirit. Another reason for Sibelius' success was his heritage, that he was born in Finland, that's for sure. It began to matter in 1880s onwards. But there is still another reason, and that really gets a mention. In addition to the critics, also the greater audiences actually perceived Kullervo as something truly Finnish. Often criticized as difficult, the music nevertheless managed to include familiar and national elements, such as the withering of the birds on a summer day, the rustling of the leaves in the forest, the echo bouncing of the cliffs, and the tooting of a shepherd's horn. But how did the listeners know that the birds, forests, cliffs, and shepherds' horns were particularly Finnish? For it's especially difficult to determine the nationality of the birds, especially those that are migrating in winter. The secret lies in effective publicity strategies practiced by newspaper music critics. A good month before the premiere of Kullervo, Oskar Merikanto was already describing the work in the Päivälehti newspaper as utterly Finnish and peculiarly original, as well as predicting the work to become the most significant Finnish tonal creation that ever existed. And indeed, people then recognized the tones as their own, as was written by Merikanto on the day of the premiere as a guideline to the listeners. It was published the same day as the premiere, so that people could read before going to the concert that this is utterly Finnish musical work. And so Finnish musical language was born. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Olli. And now we have yet another 15 minutes for discussion and comments. Yes, Hans.
No, thanks. I think this is very interesting and relevant to the topic, so thank you for that. And also, I said I'm not going to comment anything about Sibelius since I'm from Norway, but it's interesting to know that the Finnish musical language is only about 100 years old,
Yeah.
or a rather recent invention. But I just wanted to say about Grieg that he was Scottish. His great-grandfather came from Scotland, and the name Grieg, turned around the vocals there and became a Norwegian name. And nobody outside of that family had that name, so it was originally a Scottish name.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing that I wanted to ask you about or think about it is also, because you describe those different categories, art and folk. And in Norway they also talked about, the Nationalism, the national play, when they talked about folk music, fiddle music, around, at the beginning of the 20th century. And then it changed into, talking about local places. So I think there's been a historical change in how they think about folk music. And then also, I'm thinking in the history of Grieg, because I read all those monographs, and what struck me is that parts of the history has not been talked much about, and that's the political part. He said that he felt very depressed about the masses, and he performed at places called Folkets Hus. Do you have that in Finland? Similar, places where the workers' union would have their meetings.
Kansantalo.
Yeah, and hoped for the better for the masses. So in a sense, I'm thinking that the term folk also meant something different in the late 19th century, in the sense that it was maybe a larger division between the folk or the peasants and the bourgeois. In the sense that the folk music that they used as a source, the main difference was that these people had no access, for instance, to learning music notation or music theory and so on. So the folk was a different folk than we have today. I don't know.
Yes, I'm quite sorry. You're right. In Finland, as in everywhere else, the concept of folk was an area of struggle, of course. Who was supposed to represent the folk, and these conceptions which I have been representing are the conceptions of the upper classes, for sure. And there is no voice of the workman in my material.
Relating to that, I was intrigued by there was one snippet of an article there from these old newspapers referring to the word popular, and then there was an explanation that in the best sense of that word.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you had any ideas what was. So you mentioned that the notion of popular music, there wasn't such a notion at that time, but there probably were the kind of sentiments or ideas about these different categories and categorizations of music and so forth. But I was just wondering if that particular. So what would be maybe the question is then that what would be the relationship of this notion of popular to the national here? And to some extent, I don't know, I'm not sure if it matters, but the idea that popular and folk, they both basically refer to the kind of common folk or common people, and then the kind of populace. I think that they both actually derive from
That's right. I don't know yet. The search is going on, but there is popular was used in Swedish language, but there was no such word in Finnish. For example, populär konsert, it was in Finnish helppotajuuden konsertti, easy listening concert. It wasn't popular concert, and the music was it popular music? I don't know. I think not. In the modern meaning of popular music.
But I think that it sort of illustrates perfectly the different dimensions of the notion of the popular and its all the historical situativeness of it as well as with folk. That it's a different popular, and there are always different dimensions to it in different times and places and so on.
Yeah, that's right.
So, just to make things very simple, so I was saying that in the 1900s there was this great need for national culture. There was Lönnrot, Kalevala, Runeberg, but there were no art music composers that we regarded as national Finnish music. Then became Sibelius, and then they decided this is it, this is that,
Yeah.
this is national.
Yes.
And then everybody was just believing it, and it became the music and so on. Is this the very simplification of your...
That is. There was certainly a need for Sibelius. If there wasn't Sibelius, there were one other. For example, a month before Kullervo's premiere in 1892, Finnish author K.A. Tapasjärna made a public lesson on the state of the arts in Finland, and he said that, if I can find it, yeah. Tapasjärna reviewed the state of Finnish arts in a lecture in spring 1892. It was before Kullervo's premiere, and deemed it to be quite satisfactory. The state of music, however, was not equally good, according to him, but he had high hopes for a few promising new composers, such as Ilmari Kruun, but above all, Jean Sibelius. And Sibelius fulfilled those needs and hopes perfectly.
Okay, now 3. Yes, well, let's Elina first.
No, it's just in relation to what you were saying, that we have had classical composers even before Sibelius moved from the 18th century as well, like Michel. They wanted to be identified more with the German sort of European culture. There wasn't any need to have the national culture as such. We were part of Sweden and we had some Swedish identities. While I'm concerned with what you're missing here, talking about is the need also to be identified as different from the Russians, which came from the Sibelius, so American Finnish identities are separate from the Russians or separate from the Swedish. So that we use Swedes and the Russians and Finnish. How does this sort of show in your material?
Well, I haven't found any kind of identity discourse, discussion that we should be Finnish and not Russian. That kind of discussion I haven't found in my material. That's all.
So you're saying that basically what we think the normal idea that we now have is Sibelius particularly moving forward to Finland, we don't have that this kind of thing. It's actually the later discourse that we've planted in there. Sibelius has said this is, well, I'm just suggesting, I don't know what makes sense.
But there was a lot of discussion about the national versus cosmopolitan, as there was in one article which I showed you, and that was an issue at that time. And I think many composers didn't even want to be Finnish, recognized as Finnish. For example, Ilmari Kruun had 3 concerts containing his own compositions in a row before Sibelius, but nobody thought that they were in any way Finnish. They were kind of cosmopolitan thing, I think. So, yeah. Although in music historiography, it has been tried to make him Finnish desperately.
It's just a continuation of your discussion about popular, popular. Remember the Russian head, maybe this question is beyond your particular subject today, but when actually the art and I like the discourse, as far as I understood, in Finland you used as well the term light music for the popular.
Yes, it was used, kevyt musiikki, and serious music, vakava musiikki. Yes, there was that kind of discussion going on in the end of the 19th century. But this light music didn't mean the music played and sang in music halls, for example. That was something other. That was even more lighter than light music. Light music meant, for example, waltzes by Johann Strauss. That was light music at that time. No, there's amazingly little writings about music hall at that time in newspapers. That was a quiet area. Yes, I searched with the word salokimusiikki, salon music also, and they usually refer to Paris, especially to Paris and salons in Paris in 1840s onward. But there's a lot of things to do still to research in this area.
There you have one question, and then Hans on and then
This is actually a comment that I just found it very intriguing that you mentioned also this title or a term naturmusik when connected to national melodies and folk melodies, because it's a little bit different but still it's connected, and in for example Sibelius' music, you rarely hear this kind of naturtuner things. And it's also intriguing how these naturtuner vary according to which country the national music is. So this is somehow interesting. And of course, you also mentioned that naturtuner probably also at the context of the type of instruments, wooden, for example, wooden instruments. But his whole question of it's not a human, it's something very different I have found even from Soviet sources.
Okay, interesting.
I just wanted to add, I think it's very interesting that you're studying this discourse of this period, that they have discussions about cosmopolitanism and things that seem to have fallen out in a period, in between two wars, where it seemed to be more about race and more essentialist, at least. And I found similar things when looking into some of all those letters that Rick wrote, that he also called himself a cosmopolitan first and foremost, and he studied in Germany, in Leipzig, and that was quite important to being able to compose his music. So the fact that he said, first and foremost, I'm a cosmopolitan, that's something very different than, music historiography, music historians trying to narrow it down to a much more nationalist perspective that happened with some of those biographies, especially between the First and the Second World War.
Yeah, that's right. In the end of the 90s, it seems so that you can call yourself cosmopolitan person, and that's all right. It all changed after the World War I. I think it was Richard Karuski who wrote in one article that Hitler spoke about the Jews and meant cosmopolitanists, and Stalin talked about cosmopolitanists and meant Jews.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was also intrigued by this the very first slides that we had. That we had a structure position between the national and the cosmopolitan, and it sort of fits in quite, or resonates quite strongly with the contemporary questions about this. That in addition to the ideas of transnationalism and so forth, that there's now a lot of talk about cosmopolitanism and how that's a form of transnationalism to some extent. And then I think that in your project, in the broader project, that there are people who work, especially on this idea that how especially composers, artists in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, that they were cosmopolitan by our criteria to some extent. That's very, very nice. Why is the 20th century missing there, or what was wrong with the 20th century? Maybe that's a question as always, the age of extremes. But yes, thank you, Olli, and audience. And just to remind you now that there will be coffee available downstairs in the